This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. In the past 20 years, societal attitudes towards marijuana have changed widely. For a long time, fear of the plant, or more accurately, of the psychoactive compounds it contains, was the main driving force for many Americans thinking, especially at policy levels. Marijuana is still flatly illegal under federal law. It's listed as Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act, which means, at least on paper, it's the official position of the United States that there's no accepted medical use. It's simply too dangerous to be okay. Yet, most states have taken steps to welcome marijuana into society under their own laws, in direct contravention of the federal government, which creates all kinds of problems, like booming businesses who openly sell lots of cannabis but then can't find banks to safely hold their money, and universities who are too afraid to actually study the impact of marijuana on people scientifically, even though millions of people use it on a regular or even daily basis. As a Republican member of Congress who supports legalization of marijuana but who comes from a state where it's still illegal, Congresswoman Mace has some very interesting perspectives to share. We spoke with her shortly after it also came to light that Kevin McCarthy, who may be the next speaker if Republicans take back the House this year, lied to the country about what was actually in his heart after January 6th, backtracked on things he literally said on tape in order to kowtow to Trump. We got into all of this with the Congresswoman. It was a great conversation, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us, our upcoming live schedule, and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Wednesday featuring Michael Smerconish of CNN. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led the interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Congresswoman, earlier this month, the MORE Act passed, which legalizes marijuana federally. Why did you vote against it, and what makes your bill different than the MORE Act?
There are certain things in here with regards to cannabis. You can't just be one-sided about it. It cannot be a partisan piece of legislation. It's got to get through both chambers, both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. It's got to be bicameral. It's got to be bipartisan. You need Republicans on it as well as Democrats, because believe it or not, there are some Democrats who are against it, right? And for some folks, for example, with the Safe Banking Act, that didn't go far enough. You have the MORE Act, for some people goes too far on the social equity side of it. And so you got to have this consensus building, this sort of center bill. And I went to folks that were doing the MORE Act, and I was like, hey, why don't we bring parity between the States Reform Act, which has gotten broad bipartisan support from NORML to Americans for Prosperity to Amazon? Why don't we take the MORE Act and the SRA and figure out a way to work together and make it the nonpartisan bill that it can be, and figure that out? And when the amendments came up, only Democrat amendments were allowed to pass. No Republican, not any of mine, and it just lacked a lot of. I think some of the guardrails that I have in it, I have expungement and release in my bill, but I also have guardrails for kids, making sure that we incentivize states where it is fully legalized not to sell and market to children. I mean, that is something that I know that Republicans care about, and I think every American Republican or Democrat would care about. I've got protections in there for veterans. I've got really low taxes. One of the things that we've seen in regards to some of the states where they've implemented it, if you go particularly with the federal excise tax, it's got to be really, really low. It's got to be below 5%. And MORE would take it from 5 to 8 in a very short period of time. You're talking about if you have CAO, that's going from 10 to 25 in a short period of time. And so you got to keep the taxes low. You got to have some guardrails in there, and you got to find ways for folks to work together on this. And so the MORE Act will not get a vote in the Senate. That is in a stalemate. There is some debate on whether or not CAO will actually ever be filed. And when I worked on this bill, we worked on it for 9 months. And I worked on cannabis reform as a state lawmaker. Believe it or not, in bright red conservative South Carolina, cannabis reform is being led by Republicans, and they're being led by Republicans in my congressional district. So we have a very, I think, unique perspective from that point of view. But it's got to be something that we can work on together. And the only bill left standing now is the SRA, or the States Reform Act, which is my bill that I filed in November. And I'm wide open and working with folks on both sides. Yeah, I don't want this to be a partisan bill. I don't want to steal it from the other side. This is a place where Americans can agree, whether you are QAnon conservative or far left socialist progressive, everybody agrees it's past time that we get this done at the federal level. And the States Reform Act is a place where I think we'll be able to do that, and bringing all the ideas that people have together in one place.
There are right now so many efforts to decriminalize or legalize the use of cannabis that's happening at the state level, that there's different proposals from different parts of the U.S. Congress that are all working on this. We've seen public opinion, and the opinion, as you've said, within both political parties move in this direction. So can you tell us a little bit about what do you think is behind that? Why do you think that there's been such a sea change, both in public opinion and also in the opinion inside of the American political parties?
Yeah, well, you've seen it over the last decade, right? And I take my parents, for example, diehard Republicans. They're in their 80s. My father is a veteran. My mom's a retired school teacher. I tell the story when I filed my bill in November. My father's like, "Hey, I don't like this idea of legalizing marijuana at the federal level." I'm like, "Well, Dad, time out. That's not what it does. It just allows states. It provides a framework, a regulatory framework, and legalizes what states are already doing." So in my case, in South Carolina, we got CBD and hemp. Hopefully, we'll have medical very soon. Florida's got medical. California's got full adult use, et cetera. It's the rights of states to do what they want. He agrees with that, but he also uses CBD for his back pain. So I'm like, you can't be totally against this if you're using a variant or a byproduct of it overall. And so, but then I talked to my mom about it, and she's like, "Hey, you let states have the right to do what they want or not. And you've got 47, almost 50 states that have some form of cannabis or CBD or medical or recreational use." And Mom is like, "Well, hey, if I ever get sick, ship in the best stuff that will help me if I'm sick and have a better quality of life." And so that perspective is really stunning when you see that really over the last decade. And this is kind of still a controversial subject. And mostly it's just in DC, though. When I talk to people on the street, and I have polled this issue time and time again, I didn't poll my bill until after I filed it and after I got a Republican primary opponent who was hitting me on the issue. And I polled the issue about states having the right to determine and decide for themselves what they want to do on cannabis at whatever level or not. And again, there are about to be 48 states because Kansas is about to go from zero to medical here very shortly. But it was almost 2/3 of Republican primary voters, the most diehard conservatives, who are like, "Yes, we agree." and so to see that change, and you see the numbers countrywide, statewide, in different communities where people are on the spectrum, it's huge. And in my congressional district in South Carolina, the vast majority of people want adult use. They want to go beyond medical. They want adult use. They don't want to stop there. And so I think, the state of South Carolina as a whole is probably the opposite of that, obviously, but it is a changing tide. And I was in South by Southwest a couple of weeks ago. I was just at Benzinga in Miami on Wednesday. And the first couple of people I met at these conferences were from South Carolina, who are fully ready for medical when it happens. But it's like, this is a nonpartisan issue. Conservatives and progressives alike, everyone's on board with this. And we've got to find a way that there's a balance. And the beauty of having thought about this, I worked on this as a state lawmaker, now as Congress, and really understanding the issue and talking to business owners and growers and talking to leaders in government, is where do we find that balance? How do we have that sweet spot where we can have expungement and release, where we can have veterans protected, where we can protect kids, where we can invest in community policing, where we can ensure that if you're a disadvantaged business, you're not discriminated against, and that we can waive some of the fees and permitting? And how do we make this what's already happening in the vast majority of states, so they're not operating with cash only? They can trade on the stock exchange. They can deduct tax. They can deduct expenses on their tax returns. I mean, we're so far behind on the issue right now in America. The rest of America is already there, and it's the government that lags behind significantly.
Kansas is a state that's near and dear to my heart. I used to be a policy advisor for agriculture for Congressman Tim Huelskamp, and it really is a massive step forward that the state is going to medical. And you mentioned large support for GOP primary voters in your district, and also there's 70% support for all Americans, roughly, depending on your poll. But that being said, there's 85% support for all Americans to have simple background checks, yet the GOP appears unwilling to do something like that. So my question is, it seems like a lot of our politicians are older, a lot of them are set in their ways, and maybe they view the legislation like your father does. They're not maybe reading it, or they just don't even want to take that step forward. So considering that there doesn't appear to be much support within the GOP for even something like your legislation, is it realistic that the American public can expect, when you do take back the House, and you will, and you probably will take back the Senate, that any legislation will move on marijuana because of the inertia and just outright opposition that the leadership of your party has towards the issue?
Well, I will tell you, I've actually had members of leadership actually approach me about the bill once they get educated. The pushback I get from Republicans isn't on the states' rights part of it. That's actually a pretty conservative ideal, giving states the power to do whatever they want. The government closest to the people is the most effective government. And so, I remind Republicans often who push back, I'm like, this is part of our platform. It's literally in there, right? And so, but the pushback that I largely get is on expungement and release. When I explain to people this is safe expungement and release, I'm not freeing we're not freeing people who are violent. We're not freeing Mexican drug cartel gang members. We're not freeing up people who were convicted of DUIs. That's not what this is about. These are people that are nonviolent. This is only 2,600 people. This is going to save the federal government $600 million over 5 years, and it's going to save a tremendous number of lives. And it's going to bring parity to a place where there's been great disparity, where if you are Black, brown, or African American, you're 4 times as likely to be arrested for a non-violent, minuscule cannabis crime over someone who is not Black, brown, or African American. And we're going to save the federal government money. And by the way, we're not, releasing people who are violent and going to murder and rape women and children in the streets. That's not what's going on. And when you explain it to people, they're like, oh, I get it. Send me the bill. And so what I think you're going to see happen is as Republicans get through their primaries, you'll see more people afraid of their base, because I'm just sort of like, well, this is where I am, and this is where my district is. This is the future, down the road, if not now, down the road in my party, if we don't get there fast enough, but to show leadership. And I think that when we get through these primaries, you'll see more Republicans get on board. We're going to be adding Democrats in the weeks and months ahead. It'll be 1 for 1, 1 on each side. I don't want to have it weighted, 50 on one side, 10 on the other. Like, that's not what I want. I want an evenly distributed, truly bipartisan bill. I mean, my plan is to go to leadership and say, how do we do this? Do we do it part and parcel? Do we do it in comprehensive? Because there's some argument to be made for comprehensive reform, because if you deschedule it to study it for medical, one of the other pushbacks that I get is, well, we should just study it first. Well, gosh, you can't study it unless you deschedule it. If you deschedule it, you have to decriminalize it. There's a whole chain of events, a domino effect, so to speak, that has to happen so that it holds up and stands its weight in court. And then when you have those conversations, it's just sort of, well, do you do safe banking next? I do think Republicans will take leadership in this, but it's going to be a matter of negotiating. How do we do it? How do we do it in a responsible way, in a way that doesn't frighten people? I am for comprehensive reform, but if that's not going to happen, what part will we do first, second, and third? Because I don't want to do safe banking and then we don't do anything else at all. Like, you can't just stop there. It's just, businesses ought to be able to write off their expenses. American companies should be able to trade on our stock exchange. People ought to be able to make a profit off of a legally operating business. And if you're sick, you should be able to have access to it, especially if you're a veteran with PTSD. And so in what way can we move forward? And I plan on having those conversations once I get through my own election, and want to take a lead on how do we map that out moving forward. And let's come up with a timeline, come up with a plan, have hearings, and get it done.
Michigan cities, townships, and counties are splitting millions of dollars in revenue from marijuana sales last year. The $42 million in revenue comes just from recreational sales and is being split among communities that allow these sales, thanks to Michigan's Taxation of Marijuana Act.
Now, for the first year of legal marijuana here in Nevada, the total taxable sales came in at nearly $530 million. And that comes to a total excise tax revenue of just under $70 million, which is pretty huge.
Opening weekend for recreational marijuana sales in New Mexico did not disappoint.
I think we beat expectations. When we look at this, if we look at $3.5 million, above $3.5 million of revenue, generating $672,000 of total taxes.
About $672,000 was generated in tax revenue from recreational marijuana sales. Of that, about 30% will go to local cities and towns.
So assuming that we do have a comprehensive reform, I was wondering, your bill, you made it clear it's a 3%, I think, excise tax. What type of federal tax revenue would we be looking at potentially on the high end for legalization of marijuana, assuming everybody can bank and everything like you were talking about?
I mean, right off the bat, you're talking $3 or $4 billion. I mean, right off the bat. I mean, there are tens of billions of dollars being exchanged in this industry today, and so we're talking about a significant, I think, amount of money, and it's how we reinvest it. And I've got funding in there for veterans with PTSD doing research. I have funding in there to satisfy those who are concerned about kids and educating them on drugs. We've got funding in there for community policing. We've got funding in there for small businesses, particularly disadvantaged small businesses. And so, figuring out how that can be reinvested to ensure that we do this responsibly and safely. And I actually had a Republican debate for my primary on Monday. And one of the folks that had questions that wasn't able to get their question answered during the debate came up to me afterwards and was asking about specifics of the bill. And they're like, well, violent crime goes up. No, it doesn't. It's like educating people, being able to provide information and data. And kids will increase their use of it. And I'm like, no, honey, guess what? Kids are already doing it. And I have two teenagers in my house. I hear the stories of kids who can't even drive, who are coming to school high. And oh, by the way, they're also taking more Adderall than they've been prescribed and doing all of this at once. And so we do have a big problem in this country. And it's not because we prohibited cannabis. It is because this war on drugs has not worked. And we've not done a good enough job in stifling, the illegal uses of it. And if you treat cannabis like alcohol, there are still going to be laws on the books for people who are breaking the law. And we're giving states the power and the authority to make those laws and to do just as they have done for decades now, or hundreds of years, with regards to alcohol, for example. And so the States Reform Act, one of the greatest things about it is that it's turnkey. And then right tomorrow, it could be operating in a fashion that is just like the alcohol industry. Folks would be legally operating, and we'd be in a much better position as a country by doing it the way that I've got it laid out, that framework in the States Reform Act.
So, Congresswoman, I think that you've alluded to the answer to the question that I'm about to ask you, but I just want to ask it very directly because it is a matter of some controversy. So until a law like this is passed, marijuana does remain prohibited at the federal level. There's a difference of opinion about whether it's appropriate for the federal government to enforce the federal laws, even though states have passed laws ending prohibition at the state level. What's your perspective? I think that you've hinted at it, but can you tell us very directly, what is your perspective on whether the federal government should enforce prohibition while it still remains prohibited at the federal level?
Well, no, I don't think the federal government should enforce prohibition. I mean, it's very clear when you have 47, soon to be 48 of 50 states that have already passed laws that include, CBD or hemp or medical use or adult use. That ship has sailed. You're not going to put that genie back in the bottle, but we do have to bring parity where there is disparity across the states. And many of these businesses cannot bank. This is a multi-billion dollar cash industry that is dangerous. And we want to be able to give states the guardrails and incentives to do this responsibly as they go through the implementation of this. And the federal government cannot put that genie back in the bottle whatsoever at this juncture. They're not turning back. You're not going to be able to force states to say, oh, well, we're not doing it anymore. That's not going to happen.
But one of the detractors potentially from people who oppose legalization, and I support legalization myself, is they cite these studies from the NIH that says more use of marijuana increases the possibility that somebody will develop a serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and that with the more one uses marijuana, so if you're a pothead and you have these underlying conditions, it becomes the more likely the more you use it. What do you say to these people that argue that people just won't be able to control themselves and they'll develop these mental illnesses if we legalize this substance?
Well, I mean, show the data in the studies that show the opposite of that, right? I mean, I tell my own personal story. When I was 16, I was raped and I dropped out of school shortly thereafter, became a waitress at a Waffle House, and was trying to figure it out. And I was prescribed prescription drugs for my depression, and those prescription drugs made my depression feel worse. And I wanted to end it all. So I threw the medication away. I knew that it was dangerous for my own mental health. And I started self-medicating with cannabis. And so not realizing at the time, I was a 17-year-old, but, it cut my anxiety down. I could sleep better at night. And oh, by the way, I didn't want to end everything. And I credit it with saving my life. And when you look at the statistics, whether it's veterans with PTSD coming home from war who are willing to take a bullet for our country, or you meet the young woman, Mary Louise, who was born with epilepsy and cerebral palsy, who was having 2,000 seizures an hour until she got on cannabis medication, and now she has like hardly any per hour. When you see the life-changing benefits of one dispensary in one state that has an opioid epidemic, and you see that the rate of addiction and the rate of morbidity and overdoses due to opioids, whether they're prescription or off-the-street heroin, is reduced by 17 to 20%. This is not an on-ramp. This is an off-ramp, and this can save lives. And when you look at the data, you look at the statistics that are out there, which again is all the more reason to study it, that is what is going to be the most convincing for people everywhere who still have some of that pushback.
And I witnessed, my father was 100% disabled Vietnam veteran, and marijuana, he wasn't able to smoke it legally, but, I got it for him in my apartment in Virginia, and it helped him, like you said, wean off of opioids and also deal with the PTSD issues. And thank you for obviously telling us that story. But I wanted to move on. Despite being a freshman at Congress, you have witnessed a ton, from the not so great things like January 6th and feuding with that crazy woman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, very publicly, to some better things like Congress working together to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, President Zelensky addressing Congress and doing so in a way that you and your colleagues work together to give robust support. What's something that surprised you from being behind the scenes that maybe your constituents don't know about or the people listening to this show don't know about?
There are some members of Congress who will never file a bill. Like literally never work on legislation to better our country. And that's really shocking because that's literally part of the job. Like you don't just sit there and press a button and tweet stupid BS, on Twitter or social media. Like this is not about being a social media influencer. This is about influencing legislation, building consensus to make our nation better, to protect our children, to protect our democracy, to protect the Constitution, and to bring peace and prosperity here and around the world. And when you have people that go up there and literally all they do is push a button and tweet some stuff and will never get anything accomplished because they don't file bills or they're too acidic or acerbic or violent with their rhetoric, that no one will ever work with them. You just see that this has become a caricature for some people. This is like an acting job or an audition for something else. And that's really been kind of surprising. You kind of see it from the outset, but then when you're in there and you see some of the BS and the games and everything, you're just sort of like, wow, it's worse than I thought it was. But one of the, I think, good things is that there are a few folks who work incredibly hard. Like I had a 19-hour day on Wednesday. There are folks that are out there that work incredibly hard on both sides of the aisle who do respect the process and respect each other. And those are voices we don't hear enough about. And I wish that it was less about clickbait and more about substance and policy than it is today.
So, Congresswoman, of course, we're all about accountability here. And if there's people in the audience who might be listening whose members of Congress are not doing the work to represent them, it's important that those constituents know about it. So could you maybe perhaps name some names? It sounds
I
like
won't name any names, but I would just encourage folks to look up their member of Congress, look at the work that they're doing or not doing. It's very telling what you can find by just going online.
Again, you've been working with people that are creating legislation. Your staff put together this States Reform Act, and you've been in Congress now for roughly a year and a half. A lot of people from the left and the right, I'm talking the extremes that you kind of started off referencing this talk with, just trash our politicians in D.C. as being weak and feckless and not good leaders. What have you seen from good political leaders? What characteristics, what qualities do you think make up a good leader from your time in Congress?
Those that believe in the American experiment, that is an important quality to have, but also working together. I mean, I've worked with folks I never thought I would ever do a bill with Katie Porter. Well, guess what? We've done legislation. I worked on a conservative bill to streamline government and take a workers' rights issue and downsize it from multiple agencies down to one. It was a bill that was, part and parcel to something Doug Collins, a conservative out of Georgia, had started. And Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and I worked on it together and passed it out of oversight. I mean, so there is opportunity to work together where we can agree, and we're going to disagree on 80% of the things. Maybe it's even 90% of the things, but it's politics can make for strange bedfellows. But when you have people who are willing to reach across the aisle, no matter the risks, I can tell you that I get taken to task, I get attacked, my life gets threatened because I've been so effective at working and reaching across the aisle. Because I am 44. I'm a product of the 80s. Ronald Reagan was my president when I was growing up, and I would listen to his speeches, and he would encourage that kind of debate. He would encourage people to reach across the aisle and work together where they agreed, but not sacrifice your principles. And in the first 15 months in office, I passed 15 bills out of committee. And of those 15 bills, 4 of them have passed out of the House, the floor of the House. The first one was actually a civil rights bill that I did with Hakeem Jeffries. The second one was a Veterans Affairs bill that I passed out of the VA committee. The third was cybersecurity. And then the fourth was an animal rights bill. It was actually the first time in history of Congress that an animal rights piece of legislation that would ban animal factory farming. And it was particular to mink farming. Mink are super spreaders. Like, they create COVID variants. You'd not believe it. I mean, but also, Russian oligarchy, they like to buy their mink too. There are lots of reasons to ban factory farming of mink, especially if you're an animal lover, but they are super spreaders of COVID. And so it's been really eye-opening to see, okay, it can get done regardless of what you see on the media or social media, the mainstream media or social media. There are moments and glimpses of the shiny beacon on a hill that can work and operate the way it has for hundreds of years now.
Tonight, a political firestorm is brewing. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, one of California's most powerful politicians, is accused of lying about Donald Trump and the Capitol riot.
He said it's a firestorm that is brewing, and in telephone conversations recordings just released, you can hear McCarthy talking about telling Trump to resign after the Capitol siege. McCarthy first denied he said it, calling the reporting totally false and wrong. Tonight, he's trying to get out of that firestorm.
I know. I spoke to him twice today. I just spoke to him an hour ago.
That's GOP House Minority Leader and Bakersfield Congressman Kevin McCarthy after a public appearance tonight talking about conversations he's had with former President Donald Trump. Those conversations today coming after recordings were leaked of McCarthy days after the January 6th insurrection, where he spoke about recommending Trump resign.
What they said we did, we never did. I mean, I never asked President Trump to resign. We both talked about that.
The only discussion I would have with him is that it would be my recommendation: you should resign. 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 You should resign.
So, Congresswoman, we're asking about these leadership qualities. And, of course, the position of Speaker of the House is one that requires an extraordinary amount of leadership qualities. We saw your appearance earlier today on Fox Business with Neil Cavuto, where you expressed strong support for Kevin McCarthy to become the Speaker of the House if Republicans win the U.S. House in the next elections. So could you tell us, what are the leadership qualities that you see in Kevin McCarthy?
Well, he was seminal in my election, supporting me in my primary when I ran in 2020. Oftentimes, leadership will stay out of Republican primaries, and he came in early because I represent a swing district, and I'm a conservative, but I don't represent just conservatives. I represent everybody across the political spectrum, and him understanding that I'm going to take a different position than my party often. I literally promised not to toe the party line. I literally told people when I was running that I would be an independent voice. And that can be risky for some people. But when you represent a swing district, a purple district like mine, having leadership that understands that I'm going to take a different position is not because I don't like you. It's because this is a position of my district. This is a position of who I am and my principles and my values, but these are the values of my district. And Kevin has always respected that. And that is the kind of leadership that I am looking for personally. And he has stood up and, in many cases, and when people have been out of line, he's also, done that in particular in recent times. One of the things you mentioned just a little bit ago that I won't go into because I don't believe in going after, members of my own party. But, he's been there and done that and tried to hold people accountable. And that's the best that we can ask of him. And I'll be supporting him for speaker when we win the majority in the fall.
And I don't want to piss off the liberal listeners too badly, but I think you are going to be in the majority.
It is going to happen. I mean, just the Republicans are going to be in the majority. That is the reality that going into this midterm election cycle.
But we're going to assume that you are going to win, and then we're going to assume that Kevin McCarthy is the next Speaker of the House. We know that you support him. That's fine. This is how the game is played. But how can the American public be expected to believe anything that he says when it's proven that he's willing to lie to the New York Times, bold-faced lie when his words are recorded about something as important and you take very seriously as the January 6th insurrection? How can people have faith and trust in the Speaker of the House when it's just proven that he's a liar?
Well, I haven't, and I mentioned on Neil Cavuto today, I read the headlines, I read a few tweets yesterday, but I have not listened to the tapes. I don't know what Kevin said in the last 24 hours or what that was reported. I have not had a chance to read those reports. I work really hard on my district, and we're in district now. Right now, we're not in session. We don't get back to session until Tuesday. So I've not had a chance to read everything. And I read another headline, tonight when I got done with my day, that there were going to be more tapes that come out, and I've not had time to digest all of that. But I would tell you that that there are folks on both sides of the aisle who are not perfect. And as long as folks are taking responsibility for their actions and their words, that I think we can all, whether you're Republican or Democrat, no matter who's getting attacked at that time, if people take responsibility for their words and their actions, we can all move on and move forward. And I'm not going to, I've tried to be very thoughtful about how do we move this country forward. I am a single working mom of 2 teenage kids. And the things that I want to fight for are for their future, for my country's future, for protecting our Constitution and democracy and doing the right thing, coming home to my kids and saying, I made the right decision. And, there's just so much at stake right now. Inflation is super high. It's the highest it's been in 40 years. I took my kids to the grocery store last night. We spent almost $160. I can't tell you what we got for it. Probably too much Gatorade in snacks, but to get us through the weekend. But I went to fill up my tank of gas the other day. It was $80 for 20 gallons. And, I was paying $40 a year and a half ago. The situation with Russia invading Ukraine and our supply chain, there are so many things that I want to personally focus on, want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I'll tell you that there are some folks in my own party that just want to attack the other side or attack President Biden. There's plenty to attack there. But what are we going to do to make our country better? How are we going to address inflation? How are we going to address the border crisis? How are we going to address cannabis? Because this is a very popular issue that is affecting millions of people across the country. And how are we going to affect and improve the supply chain? I was just at a ribbon cutting today for Walmart in my district. It is a 3 million square foot distribution facility. It's a top 10 size facility in the world of its kind, over 1,000 new jobs, and talking about how that is going to help our supply chain, that there are just so many more, I think, important issues right now than to be looking at this I'm going to say it the wrong way, pissing contest, but within each party. That's not where the American people are. They're just, how am I going to make more money? How am I going to pay my bills? And how am I going to get my kids to school and feed them the next day? And that's what I think we all really should be focused on.
So this is my last question before we go to the audience. You mentioned being part of the solution, and I agree that's super important. But trust is at an all-time low in Congress. We have social media stoking a lot of polarization. But again, it's really the people losing faith in their leadership because they don't trust their leaders to tell the truth. So is the lesson that we can take from Kevin McCarthy, you only need to tell the truth when you get caught? Or should there be some type of greater moral responsibility for somebody who's going to be leading the most powerful Congress in the world to at least tell the truth?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen everything, so I don't want to comment on what was said or what was not said. But, I believe that whatever was said or not said, or whatever he did or did not do, I mean, he is always pretty good about addressing it straight on, and I would expect him to do that.
I just came up when Kevin McCarthy was trying to become Speaker. I was working in a House Freedom Caucus office, and these complaints were commonplace. And I won't get into what Walter Jones did and why he was not Speaker and Paul Ryan was. But this is just, I think, a pattern that the general public notices. Let's go to Eric for the first question, and then we'll go to Kelly. Eric, over to you.
In your state, there were 1,091,000 voters who voted for President Biden, 36,600 that voted for third-party candidates. Consider the way that the leadership in the Republican Party and Donald Trump speaks of Democrats, which would include those voters. How should they feel that they have a place if the Republicans are in charge going forward in 2023 with the level of communication negatively about them? How should they trust?
That it's important that we support candidates that are principled and that will be the same no matter who's in power, that they are consistent in that. And I think that is a quality. That is one of the reasons people do not trust Congress or many of our elected leaders, particularly at the federal level. And it's one of the reasons I got into this gig. I hate politics, and I'm not a big fan of politicians because, you see people go on TV and they'll say things, or they'll run for office and they'll make these promises, and then they do the exact opposite of that. They turn their backs on the people that voted for them. And I tell people all the time, even those that are mad at me, I'm like, I literally told you I would be an independent voice. I told you I would not toe the party line. I told you I swore an oath to the Constitution, and I'm going to die fighting for the Constitution and protecting that oath that I swore to. And so I have, I guess, a different perspective. It's one of the reasons that I am sometimes vocal. I sometimes get in trouble for being so vocal. But the state where I came from, that is a tradition and I think a precedent. And so my take is a little bit different. And I think it's just really important, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, that you are supporting people either through deed or through social media, or when you call their office, that you hold people's feet to the fire. And it's, for me, and I keep harping on this, it's how we talk to people, and communication is really, really important in telling the stories. And I share a lot about my family because Republicans are sort of seen as just do or die, black or white spreadsheets. Are we going to save money, cut taxes, or not? And it's even bigger than that because, when we share our stories, like what it's like to go to the grocery store and how expensive it is to get gas. And it's like, do you pay for gas, or you get your kids shoes for the basketball season, which, by the way, are like over $100 right now because of inflation. And so I take a different perspective. I don't want to be a part of that because I know that the only way we can heal our country and heal both parties, because both parties have their own issues to deal with, is to not go down that path and to not do that. And I'm not going to be party to any of that. I'm focused on the future. One of the beauties of representing a swing district is I represent everybody. And as a conservative, I don't just represent conservatives, I represent everyone, and I operate that way. And so it allows me the bandwidth to be able to be honest and be really straightforward. And if it's Republicans hating me one day, it's Democrats the next. It's like, but that's the district that I have. And so I'm not going to be, part and parcel to that kind of operation where there are vendettas that are made. And that's the kind of thing that people are fed up with. And I don't want any part of it. And I get called like rhino all the time. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like I have almost 100 perfect scorecard on every conservative report card known to man. But oh, by the way, where we agree, we ought to work together. And Ken Buck and I are friends. I think he's got that, that very pragmatic, common sense sort of perspective. And that nastiness is part of what's caused this division, that in social media. Like if everybody could get off social media for a weekend, I think our country would be far better off if we just took a break for a few hours and didn't let the algorithms of the far right or far left really dictate how we felt about ourselves or our communities or our country. And I think that would go a really long way. But being pragmatic and having common sense, you're basically a unicorn in Congress if you have any.
The last question will be for Aram, and then we will ask the Congressman her last thoughts, and then we will be done. Aram, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Congresswoman, for joining us. You caught a lot of flack for pressing on the contempt of Congress charge with the Bannon subpoena.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, why you took the stance that you took and why you thought it was important to do that, especially in light of the, January 6th Commission really heating up, which it will be soon. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I actually wrote an op-ed on the issue. When I was sworn into office, I swore an oath to the Constitution. And I often will cite, and whether it's in regards to January 6th or the Bannon vote, articles in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, or U.S. Code of Laws, Section 3, specifically talking about Electoral College. But on the Bannon vote, I sit on oversight, and we have the authority and the ability to subpoena people to come before Congress and testify before our committee. And he was trying to advocate that he had some sort of executive privilege, but he wasn't even employed by the White House or the administration at the time and was not covered by any executive privilege. And when you look at the Constitution, when you look at the U.S. Code of Laws, when you then go look at the case history, and I think I wrote a 5 or 6 page memo detailing out case history, constitutional law, U.S. Code of Laws, and the precedent, what we find is that if you get subpoenaed, you show up. You can plead the fifth. You can say you do not recall. You can say whatever you want after that under oath, but you do have to show up before Congress. And there were other cases, like we had a vote a couple of weeks ago, was Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino, who would be covered under executive privilege. So I didn't vote to subpoena those individuals. And so when you look at the Constitution, I take a principled stance no matter who's in charge or who's in power. And you're going to see that last year, this year, next year, we're in the majority. I think Republicans have a really good shot at winning that White House and the presidency in 2024. You will see that consistency no matter who is in the majority, no matter who is in power. Because again, one of the reasons that folks are so disenfranchised and with government officials, particularly Congress at the federal level, is because they change their opinions, they change their votes, they change their principles based on who's in the majority or based on who's in the White House, based on who their favorite player is. And that's not the way that it should be. And I take a lot of arrows for it, but I promise to be a constitutional conservative, and I'm gonna live and die on that hill. And knowing that I did the right thing no matter what. And I can come home to my kids every day and say, I did it right. I did it the way you were supposed to do it. And yeah, I took some arrows, but we did all right. And we're going to win. At the end of the day, I think people respect that and largely agree, but don't want to say it publicly because someone's going to shoot an arrow in their back because that's the way social media works. It's really nasty out there.
Thanks very much, Aaron, for bringing up Steve Bannon. And Congresswoman, thank you for sharing, your interest in him being held accountable for these actions. He was in the news today for another reason, actually, and that's because his two co-defendants in the Build the Wall case have just pleaded guilty, that they've acknowledged that they defrauded the donors to the super PAC, the Build the Wall super PAC.
Wow. I had not read that headline.
Yeah. In fact, they were actually stealing the money that they were suggesting was were being raised to build a border wall. So the reason that Bannon himself was not convicted in this case was because he was pardoned by the former president. Just for the same reasons that you've just said, do you think that it was a mistake for the former president to pardon Bannon in this case?
Well, I'm not president of the United States, so I cannot speak for him. But I do hope that people who break the law are held accountable, and the individuals that were part of that, that they're held accountable to the fullest extent of the law.
Thank you very much, John. Congresswoman, we got a little bit of a late start, but I do want to let you go. But before we do, I want to leave you with any last thoughts, whether they are about your primary, your efforts on legislation, your views of the country. They could be positive, negative, or somewhere in between. What do you want to leave the thousands and thousands of people that will hear this conversation with?
Well, I want to circle back to the States Reform Act. We're going to have a hearing on that bill in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, on the Oversight Committee. I would encourage everyone who I'm a big fan of when I have meetings to have calls to action. I would encourage everyone who is listening to this podcast today or in the future that they reach out to their member of Congress. And if you're going to be in D.C., that you try to meet with your member of Congress or their staff. Write emails, write letters. Make phone calls into their office and encourage them to co-sponsor the States Reform Act. It is the only bill at this juncture that has the bipartisan support to get through both chambers, both the Senate and the House. And it is past time that we get it done. So I would encourage each of you to be part of that activism, to educate members of Congress. If you're in my district, to remind people the common sense, pragmatic approach that I take to so many different issues. But my ask is reach out to your member, write a letter, make a phone call, and send an email, post on their social media, ask them to co-sponsor the bill. You can hashtag it States Reform Act. Let's get it done. And the only way it's going to get done is we work together on it.
That concludes our conversation for today. Again, huge thanks to our audience for their questions, to Congresswoman Nancy Mace, and most of all, to you for being here. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Wednesday featuring Michael Smerconish of CNN. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being part of this community. On behalf of our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.